Now it is. Okay, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us this Thursday evening for this lecture. And we're going to start off by thanking our sponsors. So tonight's lecture is sponsored by Ken and Lisa Kantorovich. It is to commemorate the yahrzeit of Lisa's grandfather, Joshua Nathanson, Yehoshua ben Reb Moshe. Yahrzeit was actually the second of, which was today, Thursday. So may the neshama benefit from our words of, I don't know if we'll call it Torah, but it is in some ways Torah because the activities we're going to be addressing tonight are Torah-based. And also during the 9 days, it is appropriate to commemorate what our people experienced and went through. And it is something that we should be mindful during these challenging times of what people went through in Europe. And we're not just talking about the 6 million, but we're talking about their worries, their concern, and there are no words to describe what the Shoah did to our people. And it is obviously an appropriate time during the 9 days to remember what so many people and so many of us here interacted with that great generation of survivors, really incredible people, and the Kedoshim that we carry on today in their memory and also in their merit. Our discussion tonight has to do with activities, rescue activities that were taking place throughout the world, but in some ways were coordinated by a specific individual in Montevideo, Uruguay. Now, the flyer that was circulated and sent with our bulletin had a picture on the flyer. And the picture of the flyer, someone commented that they thought it was Al Capone, but it's not. It is only perhaps the hat was similar. But what was under the hat was a young man that was very, very different, a person that was a Torah scholar, a person that had a commitment to the Torah of Israel, the people of Israel, the value of Israel. And that individual, his name was Aaron Malevsky, my late grandfather. Now, some of us had the privilege of knowing grandparents, not everyone, we do know that. And I myself had a privilege of getting to know very, very little of my grandfather. In other words, in those days, in the olden days, grandparents were old. Now, times have changed, right? Things change. Today, you could be a grandparent and you could be extremely young. You could still play a soccer game and you could be a grandpa. It's doable in this day. But in the olden days, right, grandparents meant people who were old. And I interacted with an old grandfather. My first intense memories of my grandfather, Aaron Malevsky, were in the spring of 1979. In the spring of 1979, I made my way to Israel as a 9-year-old without my parents. Now, it sounds crazy, and it was crazy. And there were people, we lived in Mexico at the time. There were people that were traveling to Israel, a family by the name of Smursh. And I joined them for the journey to visit my grandparents in Israel, knowing that my parents were supposed to arrive a couple of weeks later. So it was the first time I had a direct interaction with my Saba Malevsky, because up until then, every single time we would visit, I was like protected by the family. I had an older brother, I had a younger brother. My parents protected me, but here was the first time that I had to interact with the grandfather. And the first thing he made me do was daven Shmoneh Esrei out loud, because he wanted to hear if I got it right. And I'm still traumatized by that Shmoneh Esrei, where it's fascinating how many things you could point out have to be done different in one Shmoneh Esrei. And those are my first memories of a Saba. And I looked at Saba as someone with a white beard, right, sitting there at his big desk and not knowing too much about him. Only later did I start reading up and I recognized that we're dealing here with an incredible individual that really played a significant role in our history. And my Saba had a phenomenal memory. And students from the Chevron Yeshiva at that time would come and actually visit him just to hear about the tidbits and historical facts that related to the history of that yeshiva, because he simply remembered, and historians were always fascinated by people who recall the past, and he was one of them. So our discussion tonight will be a little bit about the activities during the war of this Saba Malevsky. And obviously we'll start off a little bit about his own personal history, who this individual was. You'll excuse me. Now, we'll start off in 1904. My Saba was born, according to the records at least, in 1904 in Lithuania. His childhood took a challenging turn as a 13-year-old. Not just because of World War I, but because, number one, he got sick. He got quite sick, and he was in a hospital bed for what I was told, for weeks upon weeks and months upon months. And in those days, I don't know, some claim that it was the TB, others say it was perhaps the flu, the Spanish flu that occurred. Whatever it was, he was in bed and he had to share a bed in the hospital with someone else. And he simply had to be on the edge of the bed, not to, God forbid, come in contact with another human. At the same time, right before his bar mitzvah, his mother passed away. And he was the oldest, two younger siblings. Not an easy childhood. That's what we are told. And eventually, his father, being a rabbi, sent him to yeshivot, and he succeeded, and he excelled, first in Grodno, and then eventually in Slabotka. So he was a student of the Slabotka yeshiva, and he got to know many well-known personalities like Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, like the Sri Dayesh, Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. At some point, he also interacted with Reb Aaron Kotler. So he was one who knew the great personalities of the era of the first few decades of the 20th century. In 1924, he was from the first who were sent from Slabotka to Hebron in Eretz Israel to establish a yeshiva. The Hebron Yeshiva, 1924. Eventually, that yeshiva grows. It attracts many, many more students, even from North America. There was even a student from Memphis, Tennessee, in the yeshiva towards the end of the 1920s. We're all familiar with the fact that in August of 1929, the Arabs came in and butchered 67 students, if I remember the number correctly, and they basically destroyed the Hebron community and the Hebron yeshiva. My Saba, luckily, left a month before back to Lithuania to get married. So he left a month before. And as he was leaving, he approached many of the great rabbis in Israel for smicha, knowing that he's going to enter into the rabbinate. So that is occurring in 1929. You could see here, so first of all, we thank again our sponsors. I even put that here, that our lecture is sponsored by Ken and by Lisa. And the picture that you see in front of you, you see the picture? Thumbs up picture. I'm sorry for giving you all that exercise, but you see the picture here. So in the picture on the left side, you see Saba with the nice white beard. He looked like a Saba, right? And if you look carefully in his right hand, he was holding a cigarette, because this is when it was still healthy, right? Before 1962, as you all know, smoking was no issue. So although this picture is from 1971, Nevertheless, Saba smoked, okay? And to the right, you see my late father, This is my Safta. And on the bottom, you see a 3-year-old child who's my older brother. And if you look in my Safta's arms, you will see a baby getting secondhand smoke, which is me. Okay, so that is the memories. This is the image I have of Saba. Now, in front of you, you'll also see that I have here one of the smichas that my grandfather got as he was preparing to departure Eretz Israel in 1929. So again, he arrived in 1924 and he left in 1929. There are many photographs that I saw by my aunt that they had from that period of time, from the 1924 to the 1929 period. Now, the smicha that I have presented in front of you is a smicha from Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, Rav Kook, the chief rabbi of Israel. And my grandfather went to him on the second day of Sivan as he is preparing for his departure. And in it, Rav Kook writes that he tested Reb Aaron Malevsky, my grandfather, and Rav Kook said that he had nachat, he had great pleasure from interacting with this young scholar because yadav rav lo becharifut ubepkiut. Rav Kook says that my grandfather, he has, his hands are filled with sharpness and knowledge, right? A very a bright student, ubekiyut and knowledge. So he has breadth and depth in his Torah knowledge. This is what Rav Kook wrote about my grandfather. Now, my grandfather marries my grandmother in Elul, right? So it comes to towards the fall of 1929, and he becomes the rabbi of a city called Alitus. And if you want to hear more about Alitus, you could turn to Fran and David, because Fran and David actually visited the city of Alitus. And there's a story there as well, because we sent a letter to the mayor and they welcomed there. And they were actually planning to go ahead and fix the shul, right? And go ahead and have a rededication of the shul in Alitus, my grandfather's shul. Who knows what's happening there at this point? But Alitus became the shtot, the city of my grandfather. In 1937, my grandfather was getting a little bit nervous about what was happening in Germany. Although the general approach in rabbinic circles was, no, so sein Git, it will be good. My grandfather, who was one who followed the news, was very uncomfortable about Hitler's coming to power. And he made his way to Kovna. To a senior rabbi, by the Rabbi Avram Dov Ber Kahanaman. And Rabbi Dov Ber Shapiro Kahanaman was a guide for all young rabbis in Lithuania. And my grandfather, who had a relationship with him already for many years, turns to the senior rabbi, and he says, "What do we do?" And the senior rabbi of Dov Ber Shapiro Kahanaman says to him, "Wait a second, do you have options?" And my grandfather in 1937 says, "Yes, actually, I do have an option, because I was offered a position in Montevideo, Uruguay." And I have no doubt that the senior rabbi said to him, "Montevideo, what? Like, what's Montevideo?" No one heard of Montevideo. But my grandfather was told by the senior rabbi, go. And my grandfather turned to him and said, "You know what? Why don't you come with me if so?" And the senior rabbi said to him, he was known as the rabbi of Kovna, "Listen, I'm an old man, but you're young. Go, just go, get out of here." And he left in 1937, he actually left. However, for my grandfather's many, many colleagues, you have to remember, he is a young rabbi in Lithuania. He was in touch with other rabbis. The family has a whole bunch of letters that he got from different rabbis. I have a few of them. He studied in all the prestigious yeshivot. For all his colleagues, the fact that he left a prestigious position in Alitus to go to Montevideo, you could compare it today to a person who is a big rabbi in New York and he moves to Little Rock, Arkansas. Same shock existed then. How can you depart Alitus? You were the Alitus Rav. You're a young, lucky man. You're young. You happen to marry the daughter of the previous rabbi who passed away. You got the position. You're established. You have a job. Why have you left? But my grandfather did leave and made his way to Montevideo. Now, the way I know that there was shock was because a few years ago I was going through one of the halachic letters that my grandfather was corresponding with a Beis Din in Vilna. Had to do with the get, it had to do with some halachic issues. And the rabbi, the senior rabbi who signed the letter to my grandfather, his name was Reb Avraham Yaakov HaKohen, who came from a great rabbinic family in Vilna. His father was Reb Shlomo HaKohen. My grandfather happened to be close friends with the son of Reb Avram Yaakov. So Reb Avram Yaakov sends a letter to my grandfather, but the son decides that once they're sending a letter, he's going to send regards to his former colleague. And in the letter, if you see here, it's underlined. I underlined it in red, where the colleague Yechiel Michal HaKohen turns to his good friend Aaron Malevsky and he asks him the following: Chashkan nafshi, my soul desires to know, veladat siba lama mekomo malita, right? Le Uruguay. Why on earth did you leave Alitus to go to Uruguay? Are you crazy? Like, can you please clarify what went wrong? So his move made absolutely no sense to anyone in 1938. I have a picture here that I found someone posted actually on the internet. What are these lines? Anyway, you see, anyway, a picture that I posted here is of my grandfather, in Uruguay already. So this is my grandfather. You see the arrow. My grandmother, by my grandmother is my late aunt. This is another aunt. Anyway, things do change. Things do change in 1940. In 1940, I have a feeling that if I would start interviewing those who questioned the activities of my grandfather and his move, perhaps felt a little bit different. And here's where his rescue activities begin. And we could start off by this letter that was sent by Reb Chaim Ozer Grudzensky. Reb Chaim Ozer Grudzensky was the chief rabbi of Vilna, and really, I'm going to have to learn how to stop others from coloring on my thing. Okay. So Reb Chaim Ozer Grudzensky was known as the guide for Lithuanian Jewry, the Gadol Ador. And as the war broke out in September of 1939, many yeshiva students from sections in Poland that were conquered by the Nazis were made their way into Lithuania, and there was a desperate need to take care of their needs. And Reb Chaim Ozer, who was already a very old man at the time, this letter that he wrote was only a few months before his passing. He wrote to my grandfather for assistance, financial assistance. Money is needed to take care of the needs of yeshiva students who basically are living off nothing. And I think that this was the beginning of his personal involvement with rescue activities. And it increased significantly later on. And here is history that we've discussed in the past. So this is more of a brief review. As we know, 1939, Poland is conquered, where the eastern side is taken by Russia, the western side by Germany. And many yeshivos make their way to Lithuania. And Reb Chaim Ozer senses, and this was sensed at the time by many, that although Lithuania was independent during that period of time, for the first few months of the war, this is going to be short term, because eventually the Russians are coming, or eventually the Germans are coming, and it was suggested that if you could get out, get out. Now, options were extremely limited, as we all know. Canada, right? None was too many, as we all know. The United States had a quota, but even the quota itself was not being filled because the United States did not want the Jews. The Jews were unwanted and there was nowhere to go. There was a group that with the Mir Yeshiva that made its way to Kobe, Japan. And that's the story of Sugihara that many of you are familiar. We all know that the Josh Gordon's father, Abe Kaplan's father, made that journey to Kobe and eventually to Shanghai. So a group of 400 students arrive in Shanghai. Shanghai, China, is an independent city at the time. There were between 17 and 18,000 Jewish refugees that arrived there. Among them, as I've mentioned in the past, was my other grandparents, Hillel Manes and Yenta Manes. They are in Shanghai, a different story. The problem was, what are Jews supposed to do there? How are they going to survive? So yes, there were funds sent from the United States, but they were not reaching the yeshiva students. In addition, the yeshiva students had more expenses simply because they tried to keep kosher. So financially, the situation was not good, even for the quote-unquote lucky ones who arrived in Shanghai. So what was taking place was that in the United States, there was a Va'ad Ha'atzola. The Va'ad Ha'atzola was led by great rabbis, among them Rabbi Aaron Kotler. And what they were doing was that they raised funds from generous Jews here in North America, and the funds were transferred to China, to Shanghai, that was controlled by the Japanese. That was taking place. Now, the system was not that monies were or checks were sent by mail, but rather the system was that there were actually wealthy families in Shanghai that predated the refugees. These families were well established, like the Kaduris, like the Sassoons. They were families that were there. They were originated as Iraqi Jews, arrived there in the 1850s. They had established businesses, they owned real estate, and they had money in Shanghai. Now, they, of course, were very happy if some of their money would be deposited in banks in North America. So what was taking place was that funds were raised in North America, deposited in banks in North America. They would telegraph Shanghai that specific funds were raised for specific institutions, and then they would be forwarded by these families to the specific families. That was the system of operation that was used until early December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And as a result, the United States of America declares war on Japan and on Germany. And therefore, there is zero communication between the United States and Shanghai, which was controlled by the Japanese. So the issue was, how are you going to be transferring information if it was illegal to cable or impossible to cable Shanghai? So the problem, in addition, was that once the United States was in war, there was a department where they would sit there and censor any piece of information leaving the United States. And therefore, when it came to transfer of money, there was a concern that such information would be suspicious and stopped. So a system was developed by my grandfather. Now, why my grandfather? Uruguay, in the beginning of the war, even after 1941, into 1942, and I think until 1943, Uruguay was neutral. Due to the fact that Uruguay was neutral, it was legal to cable from the United States to Uruguay, and so too was legal to cable from Montevideo, Uruguay to Shanghai. So therefore, a system was developed where funds would be deposited in the United States. They would cable Uruguay the information in code. And then from Uruguay, they would forward the information to Shanghai. And these telegraphs, I remember seeing them by my aunt. And I have in front of you, for example, one of those coded telegrams. And then we're going to try to decipher them. So in front of you, you will see cabled by Rabbi Malevsky on January 2nd, 1942. So we're going to read this cable. And it says, Aaron Well, Epstein regards everybody, stop. All the telegrams that you still remember had to stop. Also, brothers Good, Reuven regards Mirsky, Sacher, Kotler regards Kletzker, Judah Grozovsky regards Kamenetsky, Shimon regards tells, Lubliner Bethya, Jacob, Rabbonim, everyone ruin regards Navardok, Slonimer, Allwell, Cable, Health. In this cable was all the information needed of how to forward funds in Shanghai. So here we go. Let's try to decipher it. Before we decipher it, for me, it's always fascinating because my grandfather in an interview noted that he would sit one day and write the cable, and the next morning he would send it. So it comes out that this cable that was sent on January 22nd, 1942, was written on January 21. And that was the day of my father's bris, which is always fascinating to me that right after my father's bris, my grandfather sat down and was writing codes. So here we go. The instructions from the VAD were as follows. The money has been deposited as per your request. Okay, Aaron Well. And by the way, my grandfather also raised funds in Uruguay, so perhaps it's referring to it. Now, when it says over here, Epstein regards everyone, so that refers to $800 raised by Epstein. Now, I don't know exactly how they got the 800, but what I do know is that when you use the part of the system was that they would take the names of the tribes of Israel, and Reuven would refer to 1, and Shimon would refer to 2, and Levi would refer to 3. So therefore, if you want to go ahead and communicate that you sent $1,100, so that would be Gad Reuven, because Gad is number 10 and Reuven's number 1. And therefore, when it refers to Gad Reuven regards Mirsky, it means that there was $1,100 sent to the Mir Yeshiva. Mirsky refers to Mir. And when it says Yisachar, which would be Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar. So that is 500. 500, Yisachar went to Kotler. Now, who's Kotler? So Kotler was the head of the Kamenetz Yeshiva. And in Shanghai, there were a few Kamenetz students. So therefore, 500 for the Kletz Yeshiva. Not Kamenetz, excuse me, Kletz. Kotler regards Kletzky. Next, it says there, what else does it say there that we could decipher somehow? That there is Judah, right? It mentions there Judah or Kamenetsky Shimon regards Tel. So for Shimon, which is 200, went to Tel's yeshiva. So too, and you could work if you want, you could spend more time to try to decipher every single section, but it was code that was used, and even there's a fellow by the name of Ephraim Zuroff, who works for the Wiesenthal Center, who actually wrote a book about the Vaad HaTzal and their activities. And the information I have here about how to decipher these telegrams and these cables are basically his own research. So it's not always possible to know every single detail, what it refers to, but this is overall the idea, code that was sent through Montevideo. I present in front of you also a letter that Aaron Kotler received money from my grandfather, and the value was $1,000. And by the way, $1,000 in those days, I did the math, was way over $20,000 of today. And a tremendous amount of funds were raised in Montevideo, tremendous amount were forwarded. So this is part of the activities that is well known. It's published, it's talked about, I've addressed it. But what I really want to talk about today is information that is newer to me, a little bit newer to me. Now, the United States of America and the Roosevelt administration, although at the time was considered very good for the Jews, to such an extent that Jews would say in the United States that the Jews have Die Welt, jene Welt, und Roosevelt, right? That's what the Jews would say. Historians will tell you that Roosevelt was not deeply concerned about the welfare of the Jews in Europe. Obviously, he would not approve of what Hitler was doing. And obviously, he was a person that was a decent being. But the effort needed to fight such evil was not there, period. How did American Jewry deal with this? In general, Jews in America did not want to shake the boat. And therefore, the leadership, which was based on individuals like we're going to be referring to soon, they led the people with taking the traditional approach that we as Jews should be grateful to the government and not try to shake the boat. Now, as news started trickling in from Europe in 1942 about what was taking place, that already tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and eventually millions of Jews are no longer alive, there was a push by some to change the attitude. And yes, start shaking the boat and start making a tumult. And among those who get the credit is obviously the rabbis like Reb Aaron Kotter, Reb Kalmanovich, and other rabbis of the Varat Salah. And another person who history has overall ignored is a person by the name of Hillel Kook, aka Peter Bergson. Hillel Kook. Who was Hillel Kook? Hillel Kook was the nephew of Rav Kook. He was the son of Rav Kook's youngest brother. He was a Talmud, a disciple of Jabotinsky in the Irgun, sent to the United States in 1939, 1940 to go ahead and arrange and establish a network for the Irgun in the United States. They will need funds. They will need weapons to go ahead and fight for a Jewish state. So Hillel Kook was sent, and he changed his name. He didn't want to walk around being known as a Kook, so he was known as Bergson. And he had followers. He organized a group that were known as the Bergsonians or as the Bergsonites. As Hillel Kook became aware of what was happening to the Jews in Europe, he switched gears completely and got involved in rescue activities. And he tried very, very hard to persuade the lay leaders of the Jewish community to start pressuring the United States to do something. But overall, he did not have his support. I read recently a book about Hillel Kook, and it indicates that he was extremely unsettled of the lack of concern for what was taking place in Europe as the Jews were sent to the gas chambers. There was one fellow in the Roosevelt administration who was concerned, and he was Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr. His father was a well-known individual as well. His father was the U.S. ambassador to Turkey during World War I. And as the Turks were wiping out the Armenians, he was one of the few, the father, who actually put pressure on the Turkish Empire, on the Ottomans, to stop it. So he was the father was involved in trying to prevent a genocide in World War I. And the son is most probably the only one in the administration that tried to prevent the genocide in World War II, and this time to the Jewish people. There are many records of rabbis visiting Morgenthau and him understanding the situation. And therefore, in the Department of the Treasury, there was an attitude, we need to do whatever we can to somehow help the Jews. Unfortunately, there was a State Department. And according to many historians, the State Department, and I believe this as fact, was not interested. And even cables that could have been beneficial to save specific Jews, the State Department prevented the US government from forwarding them. So there was this pressure between the Treasury and the State Department. And eventually it reached Roosevelt's desk that if the word gets out that the administration is not doing enough when they could do more, it might hurt him in the elections of 1944. That is when he decided to act. And eventually, with the assistance of Henry Morgenthau and with pressure of Hillel Kook and others, they established what was known as the War Refugee Board, right? And here we have it, January, if you look carefully at this piece of newspaper, FDR creates U.S. Rescue Board, right? And therefore it's the War Refugee Board, WRB, to have a department designated to deal with issues that have to do with the Jews. And this is established in January 1944. January 1944, okay? And as Kook is deeply involved in pressuring, there are leaders in the Jewish community that are unhappy with him. And these leaders believe that he's shaking the boat. We should not be doing it. Jews should keep a low profile, be supportive of the US administration during the war, and not pressure them, not disturb them with matters that are stopping the focus on just beating the Nazis and ending the war. The name, when I read the book about Hillel Kook, the name that he accused more than anyone else for stopping such activities was a fellow by the name of Nahum Goldman. Nahum Goldman, who was the president of the World Jewish Congress. And as quoted here, Nahum Goldman spared no effort to undermine Kook's efforts, labeling his group as irresponsible fanatics. Nahum Goldman tried to sabotage the effective 1943 march to the White House. You've heard of the march. The only public demonstration, and they didn't loot, by the way. They didn't break windows, but they did march in Washington. 400 rabbis marched in Washington to urge the Roosevelt administration to intervene to save Jews. This was happening during the high holiday season of 1943. And only in 1944 do they establish the War Refugee Board. Now, it is mentioned, by the way, over here that Nahum Goldman had a meeting in the State Department, and I underlined it, requesting the deportation or drafting of Hillel Kook. For Nahum Goldman, the fact that there is this young man making a tumult, right? Not supportive of the administration, not allowing the World Jewish Congress to do it their way, was so disturbing that he wanted to get rid of Kook in any way possible. So he labeled him as an enemy to the Jews, and he also tried to convince the State Department to go ahead and, due to the fact that he wasn't a US citizen, to deport him. This is what we are told Nahum Goldman. Now, by the way, he's a big name. He's a very big name. And he was active for decades later, right? He wanted to meet later Arafat. There are a lot of stories about him, about Nahum Goldman. But for right-wing leaning American Jews and historians, he is the villain because he could have done or more, and he prevented it. So this is a name, Nahum Goldman, that when I did my research on Kook, the name came up quite often. Now, when it comes to this FDR War Refugee Board, what were they involved in? Like, well, what rescue could you do? The Nazis, the Nazis were sending Jews, putting them on rail cars, sending them to Auschwitz and gassing them, right? Like, what exactly can you do? You're fighting them on the battlefront. What can you do, right? That's a question that's fair to ask. And obviously, it's quite limited what the United States can do now that they have this quote unquote board. What can they do? So for us Jews, by the way, kol hamatzil nefesh achas, in other words, even if they were able to save one Jew, that's already the whole world. And that's what we're going to read about. And I had an opportunity, you could find online in the FDR library a whole series of scanned cables and files. And they all became declassified in 1972. And when I was reading through those files, I realized that a significant percentage of time and effort that this war refugee board was involved with had to do with Jews who had foreign documents. There were Jews in Europe that had some form of documentation that they were citizens of another country. And these were countries that the Germans did not want to mess with. And as we'll see soon, that perhaps was a tool of saving Jews. What do we mean by that? So now, as Jews are in ghettos, in Varsha, right, in Kovna, Jews are desperately seeking ways to get out. And what they did find out was that they could communicate with Switzerland. And there was a couple there, the Sternbuchs, who had connections with embassies from South America, mainly Paraguay, but also Chile, Bolivia, Uruguay, Haiti even. And what the Sternbuchs were doing was that they walked into the Paraguayan consulate or embassy in Bern, and they would say the following: what would it take to get a piece of paper declaring that a specific Jew who happens to be now in Kovna or in Varsha, that they are citizens of Paraguay? And the answer was $400 US. Now, $400 US at the time was more like $7,000 today, when most people were not earning 20. So this was a couple months of wages. But nevertheless, they sensed that there's an opportunity here. So as a result, there were many, many Jews, right? Hundreds, that had physical documents that looked like this. That we had the Republica of Paraguay, and they would have the pictures of the family members and their children. And just as some of you still remember that in the olden days, you could have children on the same passport with their parents, so too then, they had these documents. Now, as the Jews realized that there's an opportunity here, and there are hundreds of Jews with such documents, so in the ghetto itself, Jews were approaching the German officials and saying, I'm a Paraguayan citizen, I'm a Bolivian citizen. And the Nazis were not interested in terminating such individuals because they felt perhaps in the future, we have Germans in Paraguay that we don't want them to be harmed, so we're not gonna harm Paraguayan citizens. Bingo. Now, eventually it appears that although, right, that the representative, the council in Bern, in Switzerland, was producing these documents, the governments of these countries themselves were not aware of it. And when they were aware of it, they didn't make the money. They didn't support these documents. And they indicated to the Germans, we don't consider them as bona fide citizens. So now there was a great opportunity for the War Refugee Board. And this is taking place mainly in 1944, how to convince South American governments like Paraguay, Bolivia, Uruguay, Chile, how to convince them that they should indicate to the Germans that these documents are valid. So you are many, many cables that you could read. And again, they're all in the FDR library. All of them state at the end, after reading them, please burn them. But for example, I have in front of you the following. So this is from March 1944. Information has been received that there are in enemy-occupied Europe a number of persons holding passports issued in the name of various Latin America countries, including the country to which you are accredited, meaning this was a cable that was sent to all U.S. representatives in these countries. Our information is that in a large number of cases, such persons are interned under conditions which are immeasurably better than the treatment they would receive if they did not have such passports. It is reported that without such passports, such persons would be transported to Poland and death. So now the United States, right, is communicating with South American governments. Do your part. Now, originally the German authorities seem to have cherished the hopes that the persons with these South American passports might constitute a basis for the exchange of German nationals in South America. Okay, now, the United States has to make it very, very clear to these countries, because the United States, it doesn't want Jews, and they understand very well that Paraguay doesn't want Jews. So therefore, they note, in making this request, you may explain. Now, they are communicating with the U.S. Embassy or consulate in Asunción, in Lima, Peru, in Montevideo. So they are making it this, you may explain that the assurance, right, previously given on behalf of this government, that the government to which you are accredited will not, repeat, not be expected to grant physical admission to the persons involved. Meaning, the United States is telling the government in Paraguay, listen, we understand you don't want the Jews. We're not going to ever ask you to take the Jews, but at least communicate with the Germans that they are Paraguayan citizens. Okay? In general, these things did not help. Now, the way I see it is as following. The United States, when they established this War Refugee Board, it was a hope for many that something will be done. And when rabbis and lay people heard that such a concept exists, that if you prove you are a citizen of Latin America, you might be saved. So they started compiling lists and lists of any name that they know, anyone that they have, anyone, and they forward these lists to the War Refugee Board. And as a result, the Roosevelt administration had a list of hundreds of Jews, and I don't think many of them had physical documents. But at least the hope was that if they're on a list, that list would be enough to save them. I also have a feeling that by the time these lists were compiled, the majority of people on those lists were no longer alive. What makes me say that? Because I was looking through the lists. So I was looking at the FDR library, and it states there, right? You see it? Yeah, you see it? South American passports have been secured for the majority of these listed. Majority. Documentation for the balance is in preparation. We're going to get there. In other words, what was taking place is that some people that were in Lodz, and some people that were in Kovna, and some people that were in Varsha actually had physical documents. The rest of the people did not have documents, but the hope was that if you have a list and you forward it to the United States government, to the War Refugee Board, maybe they're going to be saved. So I was reading through the names of those that, and many of the names I was familiar, but one of them that obviously struck me was number 164. 164 was a rabbi in Dar Suniskis, and his name was Moshe Leib Milevsky. It's my great-grandfather. He did not have a wife with him. She passed away, did not have children. So he was on the list. Now, I don't think this list was compiled before 1944. And he was long gone because he was killed by the Nazis already in 1941. But it was interesting for me to find my great-grandfather's name in the FDR Presidential Library. That's what they were hoping for. Now, there was one location where these passports became a relevant issue, because there was a group of people that had physical documents. And these physical documents, the Germans did not want to mess with. And they transferred a group of a couple hundred from Poland and Lithuania and Germany to Vittel, France. And in Vittel, France, there was a camp there where the Jews were. The conditions were far better than the concentration camps. And the Germans placed them on hold, right, to figure out what's the status of these documents. So Vittel became a very, very significant issue. How do we deal with Vittel? How do we deal with the Jews in Vittel? And again, going through the FDR files, the files of the War Refugee Board that was under the Roosevelt administration, you see dozens and dozens of cables that relate to Vittel. Now, I share all this because I did not know that my grandfather had any involvement with Vittel. I knew about his involvement with Shanghai. I did know about his involvement with Vittel. And I also learned that not everything was well known about my grandfather. For example, we've all heard of Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, the Sridei Eish, one of the greatest authorities and minds and scholars of the early 20th century. Some of you are ones who tune in to Mark Shapiro and his lectures. And he wrote a whole book called Between the Yeshiva World and the Modern Orthodoxy about Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. He was a superstar. He was a superstar who unfortunately went through the Shoah. His conditions were a touch better because he was not in a traditional concentration camp, but more as a POW in a camp in Bavaria. But what I found out was the following. Right here, there's a letter that was sent by my grandfather. As you see, it's his letterhead. And the way I have a copy of this letter is not by going through my grandfather's files, but rather a historian that had access to Eichmann's files found it. What happened was my grandfather wrote a letter, and it originated in Uruguay in August of 1941, transferred through the Catholic Diocese of Montevideo, where he made a request that Rabbi Weinberg should come to Uruguay. He was trying to save him. And this eventually reached the desk of Eichmann, and here you have the rejection from the German authorities that they're not going to be releasing Rabbi Weinberg. My grandfather never mentioned it, right? It's only indirectly that I find out about his involvement. So therefore, it is very clear that my grandfather did a lot of things that I don't know about, perhaps historians don't know about, perhaps we don't have the information. And therefore, it was surprising for me that he did have a Vittel connection. And it works as follows. In Vittel, the panic settled in because eventually the Jews who were there in February, March, maybe even April of 1944, they started to realize that the Germans picked up on the fact that these documents they were holding were not bona fide documents, and that the countries themselves in South America do not consider the individuals as citizens. And therefore, the Germans began preparations to deport all Jews from Vittel on a train to Auschwitz. That was the plan. When members of the Jewish community, or the couple hundred, I think the number was 280, that were in Vittel, realized what was happening, they were in panic, as you can imagine, because their only hope was to avoid getting on such a train. There were suicides that occurred. It was a shreklicha situation like everywhere else. Now, my grandfather was interviewed in 1975 by Yad Vashem. And when I visited Israel 6 years ago, I had some time. My son Moshe was making his way through Yad Vashem, so I went through the archives, and I got a copy of my grandfather's interview. He was interviewed by Ephraim Zuroff, and in it, he doesn't share all the information. He talks a little bit about Shanghai, but there he also talks about his Vitel involvement. And he shares that there was a Dr. Schnurman, who was in Uruguay an activist for Aguda. And Dr. Schnurman tells my grandfather, and this is taking place maybe April of 1944, Efshar lasot davar ma. He's interviewed in Hebrew, so he says that I was told then we could do something for the Jews in Vitel. But the problem is we need money. In other words, my grandfather, if you think about it, was in the perfect location to address the issue. This was a South American issue. All you need to do is convince government officials, specifically Paraguay, because the majority of holders of such papers were of the Paraguayan, originated from Paraguay. So therefore, South America would be the right location. Now, my grandfather said, if you think it's an issue of money, I'll get you the money immediately. So my grandfather noted that he called Mr. Weinreich. Weinreich was a big name in Uruguay who did a lot of chesed. And he mentions here in Hebrew, if you want, you could read it. But within a very short period of time, he got $800. $800. Probably it would take you a good 8 months if you had a good job to get your $800. He immediately had the $800. And then they started executing their plan. What was the plan? So we are told here that Ish Tzava Hayashama. There was a person that in Uruguay, they had a connection to a non-Jew who was in the army. And what happened is that they sent him to Uruguay and they sent him to Paraguay. And in Paraguay, he connected to another military person. And the way my grandfather presents it, the plan was intact. But he does tell us that Avala Germanim shamu kvar me'inyanim ve'az hem asu et hakol vechislu otam. I don't know exactly what this refers to, but he said that the Germans got rid of them. I don't know if it means literally that the Germans got rid of these military individuals of Paraguay and Uruguay. I don't know exactly, but my grandfather ends up by saying Zo parasha bifnei atzma. It's a whole different parsha, meaning I don't want to discuss it. It's a whole new chapter. For me, it was fascinating that my grandfather was deeply involved in unfortunately, the unsuccessful attempt to save those of Vitel. By the way, from Vitel, from close to the 300 people that were there, I think 297 were sent back. 3 of them hid. I don't know if it's 3 or 4, but a few of them hid in an oven in a bakery in Vitel. There was a bakery that wasn't active. When they figured out that the Germans are doing the deportations, they hid in an oven, and they survived until the Americans freed it later in 1944. The vast majority made it to Auschwitz and did not survive. When it comes to Paraguayan documents, there are terrible stories of people that had physical documents. They came to the German representative in the ghetto, and they showed the document. The Germans took the documents, killed them, and sold the documents to someone else. And there was a professor, Isaac Lewin. I think Nathan Lewin, if you've heard of, it's his father. And Isaac Lewin's parents had such documents, and they were killed, and their documents and others survived using their name. These are the sad chapter of our people. Now, it's interesting that my grandfather points a finger also towards someone for things not being successful. That the Vitel failure, he points his finger, and if you look carefully, Ani Ma'ashim, says my grandfather, Dr. Goldman. Do you remember that name? Dr. Goldman is the one that was making Hillel Cook's life miserable because he was making a tumult in the United States. My grandfather also said that Dr. Goldman, al pia politica shelois, he blames his politics. Nehergu ele shenispu bevitel. You want to know why those in Vitel didn't survive? And these are harsh words, but different sources. And he says, "Mipnei shani tanyanti b'davar." I said I got involved. V'kimat shayinu ala derech latzila. My grandfather says that we're almost there, but the problem was that Goldman wanted to make propaganda, and it ruined it all. Okay, listen, these are hard times. These are hard times. I'm not going to be judging people, and this is to study how sad the period was. But at the same time, it was a little bit of a privilege for me to do this research. And as you can imagine, there's a lot more there. My grandfather was in Uruguay until 1970. He moved to Eretz Yisrael in 1970, spent the last 16 years of his life in Eretz Yisrael. That's where he wanted to be, and left a very fascinating legacy. There's a story which I've shared in the past that two of my great aunts, my grandmother's sisters, were sitting at a coffee shop in New York in the 1950s and having a conversation. And a stranger was tuning into this conversation. And then he walks over to them, the stranger, and he says, "Aha, you're the daughters of Rebbetzin and Kolitz in Israel." And they said, "Yes, how do you know?" And then the stranger continued, "And you have a brother-in-law in Uruguay. And you have, a nephew in Israel." In other words, he started sharing that he knows everything about their family. And this is before Facebook. In other words, he had a tremendous amount of information about two people that he happened to listen into their conversation. They were extremely curious. So eventually he shared with them a story that he worked for the Department of Censorship after 1941. And he started seeing these telegraphs, these cables that were sent to Montevideo. And it looked suspicious because it was in code. But as he read it carefully and he analyzed who it was sent from and who it was sent to, he realized that it must just be rabbis communicating issues that have nothing to do with the security of the United States. And he was Jewish. So he told all those working in his department, any cable that originates from the Varat Sala in New York and is sent towards Montevideo, Rabbi Milevsky, it should come to my desk. And he wanted to do it to be sure that no one else raises the red flag because he was letting it go through. And he basically said to the sisters, "I read every cable about your family, so I know everything about you. And just you should know that, the operation was not stopped by the US censorship because it went through my desk." So they immediately informed my grandfather. My grandfather was very happy. And he says, "I have gratitude to the Almighty for two things. Number one, that it was a nest, that it went through a Jewish desk and not someone that would have had an agenda to stop it. And number two, I'm grateful that I was able to find out about it, that I could be grateful to the Almighty." That was what my grandfather said. So these are stories about someone that valued every single life, and it is a time to commemorate the loss of our people. That's what we do on Tisha B'Av. That's what we do on the 9 days. And at the same time, be inspired by how the generation of survivors, after all the difficulties they carried, were able to rebuild and do incredible things. And hopefully they could give us chizuk during times of challenge that will deal with what we face, with the proper attitude and with prayer, hopefully merit to carry on, because that's what they want us to do, to carry on our masoret, our tradition, our commitment to Torah, avodah and gemilas chasadim, even during difficult times. David Wolf, Lithuania, Litu Synagogue. Okay, thank you, David, for sharing that information. We're going to stop the share. We're going to also end the recording. So I thank you for listening to all.